Hello and welcome back to the Sydney Dialogue, a world-first summit for emerging, critical and cyber technologies, bringing together business, government and tech leaders to debate the challenges and opportunities posed by the many new technologies that are rapidly changing our world. Wherever you're watching from around the world, let me extend a warm welcome from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and thank our sponsors, the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Facebook. We launched the Sydney Dialogue in November with a series of panels and keynote addresses over 3 days. We return now with the first of our monthly sessions, starting with a discussion on quantum technology. The quantum race is on, and it is geopolitical. The stakes are high, and the Indo-Pacific region is at the heart of this technology race. This discussion will consider opportunities for greater regional collaboration on quantum that can potentially be sustained for years to come, and open opportunities for like-minded countries to leverage each other's quantum expertise. Our host for this session is Dr. Andrew Davies, a Senior Fellow and Defence Expert at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Before I hand over to Andrew, I'd like to remind everyone that you can join the public conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag TSD2021. Over to you, Andrew.
Hello, and thank you all for joining us at the Sydney Dialogue for this session on quantum technologies. I'm Andrew Davies, a Senior Fellow at ASPI and the facilitator for this session. This is a blast from the past for me because I started professional life in theoretical physics and quantum theory. So it's a great honour for me to be speaking with such an eminent panel today from various corners of the globe. So thank you all for being here. Let me start by introducing our panel. Professor Michelle Simmons is the Director of the Centre of Excellence for Quantum Computation and Communication Technology, and she's an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. She has pioneered unique technologies internationally to build electronic devices in silicon at the atomic scale. That includes the world's smallest transistor, the narrowest conducting wires, 3D atomic electronics, and the first 2 qubit gates using atom-based qubits in silicon. She's the founder of Silicon Quantum Computing, where her team is at the forefront of developing a silicon-based quantum computer. Professor VijayRaghavan is the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India and the Chairperson of the Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council. Assistant Professor Yvonne Gao is a Principal Investigator in the Centre for Quantum Technologies and Assistant Professor in the Department of Physics at the National University of Singapore. Her team works on building robust quantum hardware using superconducting microwave circuits. Finally, Harmut Neven is an Engineering Director at Google and the founder and manager of the Quantum Artificial Intelligence Lab, whose objective is to fabricate quantum processors and develop novel quantum algorithms to dramatically accelerate computational tasks for machine intelligence. Welcome to our panellists. Thank you for being with us. I remind our audience that this is an open discussion and we encourage you to be part of it on Twitter. Please use the hashtag TSD2021. That's the Sydney Dialogue 2021. So to help set the stage, I'll start with a brief overview of what we mean by quantum technology. And that's a bit of a tall ask because by quantum technology, we mean any device whose operation isn't classical, not developed, doesn't depend on the physics developed before the 20th century. Quantum systems frequently defy easy description, and the metaphors we have for describing quantum effects are usually imperfect. It's very hard to draw a diagram for a quantum system, but we'll do our best to make it clear to the audience today. But before we turn to the future, I'll make an observation about the past. The so-called coming quantum revolution should really be thought of as quantum revolution 2.0. The invention in the past century of quantum devices such as the transistor and the atomic clock have already transformed the world. Every device people are using to access this session depends critically on quantum effects to function, as do some of the apps we rely on in our everyday lives, such as GPS. So we're really talking about a second wave of quantum innovation today, in a world where pretty much everything we do has already been shaped by quantum effects. So, with that introduction, I'll turn to the panel, and probably the thing that most people have heard about, if they've heard about coming quantum technology at all, is quantum computing. And most articles about quantum computing say that it's going to revolutionise the world. It's going to be the death of encryption as we know it and the secure internet. But I'll just ask everybody for their first take on quantum computing. Is it going to live up to the hype? What are we likely to see first? And what will the first major applications be? When will people know that quantum computing has arrived? So I might start with Michelle.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating field. It's really the first time that humans have learned to understand how nature works at its very fundamental level, say single electrons or single photons of light. So at that level, we're starting to see the world in a different way and realize that we can encode information in a different way to give us a much more powerful way to compute things. As with any technology, it takes time to get through, but I think it's absolutely coming. I think you can see the investment that's going globally across the world. So it's real and it's happening, and you can already start to access some processes online. In the long term, how's it going to change things? Some of the first applications, I think, are in the quantum simulation space. So trying to build devices at the length scale that nature actually operates at, and then understand how nature forms new materials and new devices. So quantum simulation for new materials, I think, is one of the key areas to see that. And obviously, people have talked about things like the Harvard-Bosch process for making more efficient fertilizers. In the long term, I think it's going to hit every industry. And so we're partnered with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, with Telstra, Communications Arm of Australia, to look at what their use cases are in the long term for this enormous amount of data that the world generates, how to optimize that data, how to get the best out of the data, and do more powerful computing so we can understand fundamentally the way the world works.
Professor VijayRaghavan, what's your outlook on quantum computing?
First of all, you shouldn't be betting on what I say, because you have these three experts here and they know far more about quantum computing and quantum computers than I ever will. So with that caveat, let me say that, this is an area which has been growing since the 1980s. But there's been dramatic changes both in hardware technologies, what we can do, and in computational abilities in ways which have come together over the last few years. And it's also an area where big players, Google and IBM, have put in a huge amount of money. But there are academic contexts, such as we have on the panel here, which could, for a much smaller level of investment, pull in new ideas. I think, as Michelle said, quantum simulation was going to be very, very important, but also the side effects in cryptography are going to be very important going ahead. What is the timeline for this? We don't know. Is it going to be a few years, or such as 5 years or 10 years? We can't say right now, but given the intensity of the effort, I won't be surprised if it's on a shorter time scale. Thank you.
Yvonne?
Yeah, I think personally for me, what I would like to see, or what I think we will see very soon, is the kind of bespoke quantum hardware that can, that are developed for a specific task. Could be a specific simulation problem or a specific algorithm, say, to speed up some search problems or optimization problems. And this will precede the general purpose universal quantum computers. But I think it will be something that we can start to take advantage of and solve real problems with it quite soon. And this is something that, we're all very excited to be working on, because this requires more robust hardware, even if they're not universal yet. So building these key building blocks are kind of what we're working on, really across the world in various academic and industry groups at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Harmut, I'll throw to you last, but I'll give you a slightly different angle. Quantum computing and artificial intelligence, will we see one or the other, or will they be intrinsically linked?
Yeah, quantum computing will be an interesting new computational modality that will accelerate important tasks in artificial intelligence, but also various other areas. And the area we always expect first is, we often refer to it as Feynman's killer app, sort of the home turf of quantum computing, is the simulation of quantum systems. Now that might sound a little self-serving, but as you pointed out in your introduction, many important engineered systems rely on quantum effects to function. And having a quantum computer, we can model them much better and design them much better. For example, or an example from today, this morning in Nature magazine appeared an article that was about work Google did with a number of collaborators to design time crystals, or rather investigate the properties of time crystals in a quantum processor. So you may wonder, what is a time crystal? It's a fancy name. Who doesn't want to have a time crystal? But essentially, it is a new phase of matter with intriguing properties that almost seem to defy the laws of physics. And this is just the first example of us being able to design and study materials with amazing properties that we can use for more efficient solar cells, more efficient batteries. Systems that I've recently fallen in love with is modeling nuclear fusion reactions, because we're all aware that climate change is one of the most dramatic challenges we have to address, and having a nuclear fusion reactor is probably a must to do that properly. This has been one of those technologies that have been elusive for a long time, but maybe quantum computing or quantum simulation can be a key tool here to design nuclear fusion. And since you prompted me in this direction, what does it have to do with AI or machine learning? Actually, there's another paper that I think is just about to come to the archive that shows that if you want to machine learn the properties of a quantum system, and you can transduce its state into a quantum processor and do machine learning inside the quantum processor, then you can often learn properties with exponentially fewer examples than you would need if you would learn the same properties with a classical machine. So machine learning people call this sample complexity, and you have exponentially reduced sample complexity, which is a very valuable thing. And I feel this will ultimately lead to a different way of how we observe nature.
Well, there's certainly some big ideas in that little catalogue. And I might insert one of our delegate questions, which has come from Microsoft Australia. There seems to be almost as many approaches to quantum computing as there are groups working on it. But do you have a feeling, and I'll throw this open to the panel, do you have a feeling for what the best approach is? Should we go big and try to develop a big quantum computer with lots of qubits, address the really big problems of our age, or is it better to start small and build our way up?
So, Andrew, I'm happy to start with that. I think the reality is to get, if you look at classical computing, we started with a single transistor, we got an integrated circuit, and then we started to get processors. And I think, with quantum computing, it's exactly the same. You can't go straight to the quantum computer. You have to build it from the beginning. So I guess maybe the question is more as you're building it, what do you focus on? What are the problems you try to solve? And that really comes down to the quality of the qubits, the stability of the qubits, and what the algorithms you can run, the kind of the depth of the circuits you can run. And so fundamentally, I think whoever's building a quantum computer, and I think every different person that has a hardware team, so we're obviously working in silicon, we're completely committed. We believe we've got the best approach. We think it's going to be the long-term winner. And I think every group would do that, and you need that, absolute level of commitment to go through, honestly, the pain of building and figuring out how to make it work well. And that's that's the way the world is. It's important that you have that commitment, but that you look at the long term. You want to build a big system, but you obviously have to go through all the stages to get there. And so you'll start small and find out as soon as you can the problems that you can solve with the size of the computer you've got.
I noticed, Yvonne, you smiled when Michelle mentioned the pain of developing quantum systems. I assume that was a knowing smile?
Yeah, absolutely. We just started a new team in Singapore last year. During the pandemic, added a little bit more flavor to it, but it's definitely a big challenge setting up, the infrastructure, building up a team, training the students and new members of the group to have the skills to operate these equipment and start getting familiar with how to start even thinking about designing and building quantum devices. There's really no shortcuts. We have to start with 1 qubit, 2 qubits, and maybe several before we can get to the tens or hundreds or even thousands of qubits in the next few years. So yeah, I think, there is really no doubt that we have to start small, understand the challenges, understand the problems that we need to solve before we can scale up and build towards a bigger, more robust system.
So the quantum computing is not going to break the internet tomorrow, is what I'm hearing there. Let's move on to some of the other interesting aspects of the quantum world, because it's not all quantum computing. There's a lot of other very important work going on. So I'll ask the panelists to nominate a quantum technology other than quantum computing that they think will have a major impact. And I might start at the other end now. I might start with Harmut first.
Yeah, this question I would answer by saying maybe a good combination will be quantum sensing. In combination with quantum communication and then quantum computing on the back end. I earlier advertised the dramatic advantages you can have in quantum machine learning or quantum signal processing when learning about a system you're observing. So if you have this combination, for example, you have a very sensitive magnetometer, let's say in a hospital, to take heart signals, it sits somewhere in the ocean to measure magnetic fields there. If then this signal through coherent internet quantum communication protocol gets into a quantum processor, then you can analyze it there. So this combination, again, quantum metrology, quantum communication with subsequent quantum processing could be a very powerful combination.
Yvonne, do you think that you need a whole package, or are there things that quantum devices can do, even hooked up to a classical computer?
Yeah, I think what has been just described is sort of the long-term goal, where we have a quantum network linking up different devices built on the powers of quantum mechanics. But in the beginning, perhaps we'll see this kind of hybrid classical quantum approach, where we have a device that's functioning, for example, a quantum sensor that's very sensitive to certain effects, such as electric field or magnetic field, and this will be hooked up to a classical computer, such that it can be used locally to detect a small effect that we're interested in. But ultimately, I think we do want to be able to link them up in a more networked way, such that we can do more powerful, more distributed information processing to really harness the full power of this technology.
Okay, Professor VijayRaghavan.
Yeah, I think Harmut and Dr. Gao said everything which needs to be said, but let me just add very briefly, elaborating on that. Now, to develop quantum sensors and quantum limited measurement protocols that perform near theoretical limit to their sensitivity set by quantum physics is an important goal. And these interface sensors and clocks and quantum communication networks to build, for example, advanced secure networks. These can be used for remote sensing, global positioning, to design and develop sensors that surpass existing sensitivities, for example, in rotations, accelerations for space, military, civil applications, quantum radar, quantum LiDAR. So these are all areas which are pretty much hinging on the development of portable sensors, which are very sensitive, but also portable for civilian and strategic applications. And building, for example, the most advanced clocks that can have several orders of magnitude better sensitivity for navigation and timing for terrestrial and deep space applications. So these are areas where we're going to see rather rapid outcomes, I think, over the coming few years. And what Yvonne and Harmut have said is really about these coming out fast.
Right. Michelle?
Yeah, I've got a slightly different way of looking at it, and then I guess for me, there's a couple of answers I've got. The first one is really, it's like when the man went to the moon. You're building a rocket ship, and it's got to have everything working. So for me, quantum computing is the rocket, it's the whole thing, the whole package, and it's to some degree quantum sensing, quantum communications, or the boosters, or or the radar, whatever it is, different parts of it, but the whole package is the quantum computer, and those other things feed into that package. And I very much see that the danger is that we start to get distracted by the smaller components and don't go for the big goal, which is to get that rocket to the moon. So that's really what I guess we're focused on. So that's the first answer. But then I guess the second answer, if I look at it and I think about what we're doing and go ahead 100 years, what will we be remembered for? And I think the thing that I think that we've done globally, but also in our team, is to develop technologies to manufacture at a different length scale. So having the ability to manufacture with atomic precision, that allows us to make new very sensitive magnetic sensors. It allows us to simulate new materials such as superconductors. It allows us to look at solar cell designs and optimize those, but also makes new devices. So there's a lot of companies out there looking at making very small cameras for spyware by being able to manufacture at that small length scale. So opening up a whole new way to manipulate the world at smaller and smaller length scales is going to open up all kinds of new devices that we can't even think of now. So that's kind of a double answer.
Cool. I've spent a lot of my professional career writing about Australia's development of submarines, and one of the things that occurs to me is that quantum technologies have applications both for things like submarine navigation, a submarine being able to sense where it is in the Earth's magnetic field, for example, and very fine inertial navigational systems, but also the quantum magnetometers in terms of detecting the presence of a submarine. These new technologies will have a significant impact on a lot of the established security-related technologies that the world's militaries and a lot of national security is built around today, won't it? So with that as a bit of a segue, looking at the headline figures for investment, China seems to be spending about spending as much as the next 8 countries combined on quantum research. That's if you look at official figures. Probably there's some private sector figures that are not caught up in that number. But should we be worried about that? Is this a geopolitical competition? Do we need to be the first to these quantum technologies? And I'll just throw that as an open question to the panel.
Challenge is that the scale of investment in research by China is so enormous that you could say, you could point to this differential for many, many things. And therefore, there are 2 routes to quote unquote catch up: match that scale, or do things which bore through the mountain of various kinds of investment and ideas. Now, so it depends on who you are. If you are a rich country or a rich company, you can think about matching that scale and competing on that front. Others, I think, must look to their extraordinary human resource capabilities, continents such as Africa, countries such as India, to see how other routes to getting a strong presence in these cutting edge areas are feasible, which is a combination of big investment, maybe not of the scale China is doing, but also along with the high quality training and teaching.
I think that's very true. I mean, I think fundamentally, I saw Yvonne's going to probably say something similar, I don't know, but you're building teams that have to work together, and those teams have to work across a whole range of hardware, software, mathematicians, physicists. And I think it's that ability to form well-performing teams that work well together, that get on together, that understand the end goal. So that human capital is absolutely essential, and that's definitely something I've learned setting up the company. It's quite critical to get that team functioning. But fundamentally also it's just who you collaborate with and how you do it. So it's a very pragmatic field. You work with who you need to work with. And at some point you can throw obviously lots of money at a problem, but that doesn't necessarily get you the right outcome. So getting the teams working well together, getting the right people pragmatically working together, I think is the most important aspect of this.
Yeah, and I agree. Just to add on to that, I think in terms of dollar amounts, it's it's a very sizable number, but I think the human capital is almost the more precious commodity at this point. I think the biggest competition at the moment is really the competition for talents, hiring the right people, building the right team. At the same time, international collaboration is absolutely critical. I think for a lot of us working in the superconducting field, we know this very well. Our fridges very much come from wherever we are in the world. A lot of them come from Finland or the UK. And so, this kind of international co-working, co-development is critical. And I don't think we will be moving away from that anytime soon. So I think it's not really a competition of who's going to have it all and leaving nothing for anybody else. It's more of how can we work together to really get there faster and in a more sustainable way as well.
Okay, so there's clearly some national interests involved in quantum technology. There's also tremendous commercial opportunities there as well. So one of the things I'd like to explore, and I might ask Harmut to start on this, is how should we go about, what's the best sort of national strategy for getting a leg up in the quantum world? How does government, academia, industry work together? How best does that combination work?
Well, obviously, like with any information technology, you need to build out a complete ecosystem, and different components, academia, startups, larger companies, government labs, all have their role to play. For example, building an error-corrected large quantum computer, the investments is in the billions of dollars, so that probably ought to be an industrial company or a large government lab. In academia, that won't happen. But academia is great, let's say, for application discovery, algorithm design, or refining components needed in a quantum computer.
Okay, Professor VijayRaghavan, what is India's thinking at the moment? What are you telling the government they should be thinking about?
Well, actually, it's along the lines of what Harmut just said. Depending on the scale and nature of the problem being attended to, different components come into play. We have a major quantum mission of several, billions of dollars being rolled out, and it has components of collaboration with industry, setting up quantum computer attempts in different kinds of national laboratories, and a distributed mechanism of academic interactions on a wide range of problems. And these also include international collaborations. So it's a portfolio pretty much along the lines of what Harmut has said. And I think with India's substantial investment over many years in basic physics, computer science, mathematics, we're going to see at least significant contribution coming from here.
Okay, thank you. I might get a view from Singapore.
Yeah, I guess I don't really speak for the Singapore government, of course, but from my perspective, what we've been seeing is actually a really concerted effort to promote the development of both the quantum technology itself, as well as a lot of the necessary and crucial engineering solutions that surround this technology. So, for example, since I came back to Singapore from the US, we realized that there are lots of really excellent academic research groups working on, say, microwave engineering or photonics fabrication, and they haven't really been working on quantum technologies per se in the past years. But now with this more involvement, more cross-discipline collaboration in the country or internationally as well, a lot of these teams that are building these excellent capabilities are now getting involved to help build these solutions that can really help us accelerate our development. So I think there is a push for strengthening our capabilities in these various other supporting and auxiliary technologies as well.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, you'll be aware, of course, that Australia's chief scientist, Dr. Kathy Foley, has been asked to form the quantum commercialisation hub here in Australia with some government funding. How do you see that working?
Look, I think Australia's been in a terrific position. So obviously through the Australian Research Council, they funded Centre of Excellences, which have been going since 2000. So 20 years of investment in those, which is a couple $100 million in each of the application areas that includes quantum computing. But then obviously in 2017, the Australian federal government invested directly with an equity play in silicon quantum computing, along with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, the big bank, one of the big four banks, and Telstra, the communications arm, as well as the university and state government. So that kind of co-investment with industry, government, and university working together has allowed us to set up a startup right next to the Centre of Excellence. So it's got a feedstock of excellent researchers coming in. It's become incredibly popular. We've got huge numbers of people wanting to join from all over the globe. And it's in an area where we have a competitive advantage. So I think it's the government's actually got behind this. I know, we obviously hired John Martinez from Google last year, and he said he would love to have done that in the US. So Australia is a smaller country, but it's able to kind of pivot in these innovative ways. And I think getting that triple investment behind the company has been fantastic. And obviously, Kathy's working on, making the quantum computing hub and trying to expand that out across the country. So it's a hugely exciting time here in Australia. And we're looking, to partner globally with all the international players that we've been working and collaborating with for years, including the US and India and Singapore. So it's, it's a very exciting time here for us.
Sure. So speaking of international collaboration, one of the things I wanted to tease out, particularly given ASPI's remit in sort of national security and strategy, is there a strong element of competition for quantum technologies, or is that overstated? The Australian government has, in a couple of instances, refused to fund some research collaboration on national security grounds, particularly where researchers from the People's Republic of China have been involved. Is that something that we need to be on guard about with quantum technologies? How do we decide when a very broad collaborative approach is the appropriate one, or when we need to keep things a bit more to ourselves and be a bit more guarded about it? How do we make those judgments? Hartmut, we might start with you. You made the mistake of moving.
No, I have a strong conviction about this. I think it's important for humankind to have a quantum computer as a tool quickly. Earlier I mentioned how it could be a marvelous design aid for nuclear fusion, and we can't wait to have these things as soon as possible. So therefore, I would like to raise a little bit beyond petty competition, for example, between companies to company. We happily write papers together with co-authors from Microsoft or from Amazon, of many international collaborations. And so I see it rather company versus company, or nation state versus nation state. It's more humankind versus nature, or I should maybe preferably say humankind with nature, to bring this new capability about. So yeah, probably I'll stop here.
Okay. Is that a view the rest of the panel share, or are there elements with a national security aspect?
So I think from the maybe more academic point of view, at this point, we really still see the community as a very open and international one. We collaborate with teams around the world, in the companies as well, because we solve such different problems, and together we can, accelerate the development much better than we would individually. So, so I think I definitely share the view Hartmut had about how we can, work together is really, all of us combining our knowledge to get there faster than like us competing against each other, so that, one might get slightly ahead compared to the rest. It's just not the most sustainable way of achieving this goal.
Sure. Which actually brings me to something that I've been thinking about this. Is this the sort of thing where you could reasonably expect to keep something secret if you got there first, or is it something that once one team works out how to do it, almost by osmosis, others will work out how to do it? I'm thinking of like the 1940s with nuclear weapons. It wasn't long before other countries worked out how to do nuclear weapons, right? Once it's obvious that it's doable, it seems to be easier to do it. Is that a reasonable observation?
Look, I think it is. I think it's funny, Andrew, because we had probably a decade ago, I had an author for a book come and ask me, I want to write a novel about if Australia was to develop the world's first quantum computer, would the rest of the world know? And so we brainstormed for a few hours about how we could scoop all the funding in the world over to Australia in the end. But eventually people would know. And I think that the nature of research is that everyone's working towards solving a common problem. And a problem that when we do it, it has utility to everybody. So it's globally useful. So I absolutely get that. But I guess one of the things that definitely has happened since COVID is that concept of sovereign capability, and every country making sure that it isn't so reliant on other countries that it can't sustain itself. And I think that whether you like it or not, every country has to take that into account. And in the quantum computing field, Australia's been in a very strong position. We've had huge teams for large periods of time. we're very keen to partner with the rest of the world, but obviously we don't want the rest of the world to come in and raid us, just take the best and leave us behind. Yeah. So I think there's an element there of every country has its strengths and collaborating where it's strong and working to the benefit of everyone. But obviously not having the big guys come in and scoop the pool and take everyone away. So I think that's kind of where we all hope to be.
Right.
Just curious, was that book ever written?
It was, it was, and it's terrible because I've forgotten the name of the author, and I've had this. I've
No
mentioned it
way.
multiple times. He actually sent me a big much first, but I will find it out because it has been written, and apparently people have read it and thought it was great. So I will find it out.
That sounds like a very interesting premise.
Look, I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about here, but I've got to leave some time for some of the delegate questions that we had. So let me just ask a 30-second soundbite from each of you. You tragically fall into a coma today and you wake up in 2050. What does the world look like and which quantum technology has had the most impact? And we won't hold you to this in 2050. So I might start with you, Michelle. We'll go left to right.
Gosh. Okay, so I wake up 2050. Australia's developed the world's best quantum computer. There's no longer traffic problems in Sydney. We've got a thriving quantum devices industry where people are coming in and getting their problems solved, whether it's the pharma industry, mining industry, logistics, defense. We've made fertilizer and agricultural inputs a lot cheaper, and we're helping to feed the world, and the world's a much better place.
That sounds like a very nice 2050 to wake up in. Professor VijayRaghavan, what does India look like in 2050?
Well, I would say India would look like, very similar to the rest of the world. All of us would be grappling with adaptation and mitigation with regard to climate change. And quantum technologies would be incredibly valuable in adaptation. You would be able to take very complex problems such as rising sea levels, floods, earthquakes, and so on, and be able to simulate multi-parameter complex situation in advance of them happening and be able to deal with disasters much, much better. On the other side, we would also, I hope, have a situation where we have had extraordinary education and training so that people are empowered to use these technologies to develop solutions in their context and not be dependent only on large global successful players. So that combination is what I see happening.
Okay. Yvonne, what surprises you in a happy way or perhaps a sad way in 2050?
Well, I think at that time, all the nations really, regardless of how big or how technologically advanced they are, would have reliable and secure access to some quantum computers, maybe not hosted locally, but somewhere in the world. And I would really love to see, little children, like kids these days, like 12-year-olds in 2050, just programming quantum computers, building new apps that I haven't even dreamt of, and just be surprised by that. I think that'll be a fun thing to see, and perhaps very much I'm afraid of that too, to be like, to lag behind of these new developments where they can just come up with because they are born into a world that are, they're more familiar with quantum technologies. They are more native than some of us. So I think that'll be something very exciting for me.
Okay. Harmut, you are very much of the view that quantum computing is a tool for humanity. It's 30 years from now. How did we do?
Yeah. And it seems to be the case that the ability to do information processing in the biosphere and the technology sphere seems to follow exponential trajectories. And quantum computing may even be special in the sense that it, by some metrics, increases doubly exponential in capabilities over time, which makes it almost impossible to predict what's going to happen in 30 years. One more tidbit, in 2025, there will be more transistors on the planet than there are human cells. So, I mean, if you look at those situations, the notion of a singularity comes to mind, as my colleague here, Ray Kurzweil at Google, pointed out. Now, raw singularities in nature seem to be rare to observe because things like friction happen. And I think we see this already, that societal friction happens when technology follows such exponential trajectories. So one thing we have to be very mindful of is that sort of nobody is left behind, that quantum computing as a very powerful new computational technology benefits all of mankind, and everybody is included. So that's a concern or worry I have, we should be mindful of.
You guys have just reminded me how much more fun it is to talk to scientists than it is to national security people. You're able to think big, happy thoughts instead of big, unhappy thoughts. And it's actually quite refreshing for somebody who's spent the last 20 years like I have. So let's turn to some of our delegate questions that we've got. I've got a question from Julian from Senitas, who asks, what are the chances that a sovereign state could make a major undisclosed breakthrough in quantum computing, giving them a kind of secret superpower above everyone else? And Julian cites as an example public key encryption, which was discovered in secret by cryptographers within the UK government, some years before it was independently discovered and published by academic cryptographers. So is it possible that there is a country out there that already has a quantum advantage and we don't know about it? Michelle, is that possible?
Look, I think it probably is. We've been funded by the US government for 20 years. They got into quantum computing right at the beginning. So I think different countries have a level of awareness of the importance of technology and get in at the ground level. I've already praised Australia to get in right at the beginning of the hardware development of that field. So, you just don't know what's going on. I suspect there are groups that are working on things that none of us know about. And that's the way that the world is. I don't necessarily see it as a negative. It's just the way that technological development happens. And, as we all learn to understand things better, this kind of deep understanding at many different levels, whether it's defense or industry or universities, is the way that technology happens.
Sure. And looking at that example of public key encryption, yes, it was discovered within government security organisations first, and there's other examples of cryptographic attacks that were developed within the NSA before they were known to the academic community. But eventually these things tend to be discovered. So is it necessarily the case that any advantage is likely to be an ephemeral one?
But the problem is that you're going to always have companies or countries having ephemeral advantages. But at the fundamental level, you're going to see breakthroughs coming in which reduce these advantages. And this has been the history of applications of technology over millennia. It's really difficult to sustain. So you're going to see advantages coming up, but you're going to see leaks and breakthroughs which mitigate those advantages constantly.
And I think just to add on a little bit, this does come back to something we mentioned at the very beginning, which is back to the people, the talent development. It's very much possible that certain countries or companies or academic groups has a big advantage at the moment, but with the way we train our new scientists, our young scientists, in such a collaborative as well as international landscape, it's very unlikely that this kind of advantage will be locked down and kept forever, because just the way I see it, my students, they come from really pretty much all continents of the world. And I was educated in various different countries and now brings my knowledge back to Singapore. So I think this kind of experience is very universal at the moment. And with this flow of information and experience and knowledge, it's really unlikely that a certain absolute advantage can be kept secret or for long periods of time, at least, in my opinion.
Yes, look, I think that's probably right. And just looking at the history of military technology, you can have a decisive advantage one day that's passé 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So let me move on to the next question. This is from Belinda from Microsoft Australia, who asked, how can we further the general public's understanding of the vision and purpose of quantum computing? Given that it's really hard to explain quantum systems to people, in fact, it's hard enough to understand them without having to explain them, how do we go about it? So let me start with you on this one, Harmut. When somebody says, so what are you doing and how's it going to change my world? How do you explain it to them?
people who know me a little bit, I'm a huge fan of the many world interpretation of quantum mechanics, which says that sort of what we experience right now is only a tiny classical sliver of a much richer universe, a multiverse, which is actually comprised of classical worlds, such as the one we experience right now. And I'm not going through the explanation right now, but I think if you take this viewpoint and you swallow it as a proper description of the universe, the multiverse, as given by quantum mechanics, I feel many of the paradoxes and the complications disappear. And if you hear it a few times, then you get used to it. And I think it will seep into cultural mainstream. Yeah, I remember vividly when my 4-year-old boy came to me and said, "Dad, you know, if you fly next to a black hole and you point your finger at it, your arm will get longer." So he understood some concept of general relativity. And in the same way, if you look at modern cartoons, you see that the notion of the multiverse or multiple universes is seeping in, and it becomes more and more natural. And my kids also start to think in these terms, and then suddenly quantum mechanics doesn't seem all that strange anymore.
Vijay, in your role as a government advisor, so you often find yourself talking to people who don't come from a scientific background. Do you find that they are able to appreciate the potential, or how do you go about convincing them that this is something they need to pay attention to?
Well, you know, there are two broad categories of interactions. One where people use technology seamlessly without understanding what's inside or need to understanding what's inside. There was a time when you could open up the hood of your car and see what is happening and actually understand how a car works. Today, it's near impossible because you see electronics when you open up the hood of a car. But yet people use cars all the time. They're quite comfortable with it, with a general understanding. Historically, knowledge has been power, and those without knowledge are those without power. And today we're seeing extreme asymmetries in the accumulation of knowledge and therefore of power. And therefore we need human resource development, training of people in large areas with young demographies, India, all of Africa, for example, South America. These are very, very important, because otherwise we will turn these extraordinary technologies into prosthetics which we use with great effect without understanding the strengths, limitations, and dangers of them. So education, I think, is very, very important.
I might ask Michelle and Yvonne to expand on that a little bit in terms of the background that we're producing young scientists. Is our education system in science still fit for purpose for the 21st century, or does it look a bit old? Yvonne?
Yeah, I think the education system needs to be evolving constantly with the technology, with the world. So that's a really good question, because I think here we're constantly thinking about how can we catch up and adapt. And then this can be done, I think, just as long as we're aware of it. So right now, I think in Singapore, at least, a lot of us working in quantum research in various different fields of quantum research, really, we go to schools and engage with, not just university students anymore, but secondary school students, to just give them a glimpse of what these technologies are about. And, if they're interested, what are the possible ways that they might be involved, they might be able to get involved in. So, it's this aspect is extremely important. But I think just to go back, perhaps it's just my physics training, coming back again, is just ultimately there are these fundamental knowledge of physics, mathematics, chemistry that we just need to cover regardless, right? So there is this core part of education that will perhaps stay, but then there will be the additional component that's evolving very dramatically over time. And this additional part really involves all of us scientists working in research going into the schools to bring what we know, what we see, the challenges we're solving to the students to make it more relatable and more accessible to them. Because you wouldn't expect a 14-year-old to read scientific journals, right? But if we can talk to them in a more accessible way, I think that's how we can get them engaged and involved.
Well, it's making me feel old, but the last time I taught quantum theory, quantum computers weren't a thing. So I can't help but think if you were trying to teach quantum theory or quantum field theory, that it would be a nice motivation to be able to say to people, this is the technology of the future, quantum computers are a happening thing. Michelle, do you find that you're able to engage people on this subject?
Look, I do. I think that young people in particular are far more savvy than we ever give them credit for. So we've got open days where we go down to primary school level and bring 200 children through our labs each year. From the ages of 6, 7, 8. So I think that's for me, it's opened my eyes that these guys are ready to engage. But I think the thing that I'm kind of grappling with at the moment is that sense of resilience. When you're designing and building new technologies, you need people that can stay the course and build in resilience. And unfortunately, I think over the last decade or so, we've moved to a world that's been dominated by software, where everything's very easy for them to get hold of, and information is very quick. For me, getting them to actually build things and things that are difficult, complex is something that I think we've really got to build into our young people. I've been obviously incredibly impressed with countries like Taiwan and India. In Taiwan and TSMC, they've got a semiconductor manufacturing line there that for the last 20 years, they've invested in their young people, made them recognize that engineering and solving difficult hardware challenges are the things that are lauded in their society. So they've trained people to be resilient, and they're getting the benefits of that now. I've certainly been to India and given lectures in India, sometimes with thousands of students, and the quality of knowledge in India and their engagement with understanding things at a very deep level, I think is incredible. So building resilience in our young people globally, I think, is something we've really got to change at the school level, right down, start with primary, go secondary, and then you find that they love quantum. I've not met anyone under the age of 20 that doesn't love quantum so far.
Wait till they have to study linear algebra to understand it. That'll temper them a little bit. Actually, it's very interesting. I'll pick up on the point you made that quantum computers are not like classical computers where you can just plug a motherboard in and away you go. There's a lot of serious engineering, sometimes cryogenics, whole lot of difficult hardware problems before you even get to the software. And that brings me to a delegate question from Lucy in Perth, who says, given the extreme temperatures and engineering required to operate quantum computers, what are the panel's thoughts on the environmental impact of quantum computing? We've already seen Bitcoin mining with classical computers is already making a significant impact on world power consumption. It's substantial fractions of 1% of the world's energy consumption. But a quantum computer is generally speaking going to be much more energy intensive. So would a world full of quantum devices necessarily be a more energy hungry world? I'd be interested if anyone's got a view on that.
So I think that starts with you, the superconducting qubits, because you need the lowest temperatures, but I'm happy to take it after you.
Yeah, this is a question that we hear often, but how do I say this best? I think net quantum computer is not. I mean, if you have to compare equivalent or similar computational capabilities. So if you compare a large fault-tolerant quantum computer to a exascale, petascale supercomputer, you will find that the energy consumption of the quantum computer will actually be lower. And of course, for certain computations, because you need so many more steps, sometimes exponentially more steps to solve this task in a classical computer versus a quantum computer, you will again need more power when you do it classically. So it's not automatically, or it's not true that quantum computers are a more power hungry technology. Now, of course, the piece that nobody knows, if quantum computing is as successful and will be as widely used as we hope, then of course there will be a large demand for quantum computing, and they will be used a lot. And net, it's a lot of power being used. But I had once a professor who said, like, pretty much anything you can do, and you multiply it by 8 billion, as in we are 8 billion humans, any activity you do has environmental impact.
Is there a foreseeable future where there are a relatively small number of quantum computers tackling the big problems, but we continue to sort of use the classical computers for the everyday things? Like I'll still be watching Netflix on classical systems, presumably for some years to come. Is that the kind of model we're looking at least in the interim? Absolutely.
I think the thing to remember with quantum computers is you can solve problems with quantum computers theoretically and eventually experimentally that just cannot be solved with classical computers in a time frame that's useful. And they may be things that help us to make advances that will benefit the world a lot better than building lots of classical computers. But classical computers are going to be used for all the boring tasks like watching Netflix.
Look, unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time, but I will do one last pass across the panel on sort of last thoughts, or what would you like to see happen in the next 5 years, or what do you think might happen in the next 5 years that will be revolutionary in the field of quantum tech? So I might start with you, Vijay.
I think, as we heard earlier on when you asked about more proximal applications, various kinds of sensor technologies connected to computing, classical computing, would be an area where I would see expansion substantially. These kinds of sensors would be invaluable in agriculture, health, surveying, navigation, and so on and so forth. And I see those taking off substantially faster than quantum computing per se. So quantum sensors of various kinds would be very, very, I think, likely to happen in the foreseeable future.
Yes, no, I think that's a good point, and I think that's something that's often missed. People say that, quantum computers, you need large numbers of qubits. You can actually build really useful devices with just a few. And I think that's exactly what you've touched on there. Yvonne?
Well, I think for me, I think the most exciting thing I would like to see is perhaps us making a big improvement in terms of quantum error correction. Perhaps not a fully quantum error corrected fault-tolerant computer yet, but just a handful of error corrected or protected qubits that we can start to really test all of these ideas that we had about fault tolerance on. And I think tackling this challenge will also give us a lot more insights about how do we go about building larger systems with quantum error correction. So yeah, I would say in the next 5 years, there will be something that I would like to see, and definitely something that we are going to be working on a small scale. So that will be the main thing for me.
So sort of those enabling, stabilizing technologies for quantum computing that will enable us to build on it.
Yeah, and also doing correcting the quantum errors that's occurring during the computation on a small system. Yeah.
Sure. All right. Hartmut?
Yeah, would very much plus one this statement from Yvonne. To run a large, complex quantum algorithm, you need to decompose it into many gate operations, often millions, if not billions, of such operations. That means that each operation, in order for your computation not to crash in the interim, each operation has to be executed with a very low error rate. That requires to implement quantum error correction techniques. And our hardware development roadmap, which we have published, there are many talks you can find on YouTube, which describes our roadmap. But for the next years, what we will focus on is to demonstrate that quantum error correction can be implemented in practice.
Okay, Michelle, looks like you get the last word.
Yeah, it's dangerous. Okay, so I think we're very excited about our physical systems being very high quality and ability to scale with stability. So I'm really looking forward to Australia building that rocket ship, and the Australian government getting behind the Australian startup companies, bringing them together, linking globally where it's pragmatically making sense, and build the fully error-corrected quantum computer here in Australia and linked globally.
Okay, no, that sounds like a good thing to look forward to. All right, so unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank all of our brilliant panellists for their contributions today. And thank you to our Sydney Dialogue audience for tuning in. Remember that you can join in the dialogue yourself on Twitter, #TSD2021. And that closes the final dialogue session for this year. So on behalf of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, I'd like to thank you all for joining us and remind you that ASPI will be hosting more virtual sessions between January and March in 2022. Head to the Sydney Dialogue website to explore the program, catch up on sessions and read the Sydney Dialogue playbook. In the meantime, you can continue the conversation on Twitter, #TSD2021. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks once again to the panel. I thought that was a terrific discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. And from ASPI, we'll see you in the new year for our next sessions.